Chapter 14 California and Fairy Tales. By the beginning of 1974, Bruno and True Bettelheim had settled into their new home in Portola Valley. Though they had purchased it from an Austrian couple, it was a long way from the Ringstrasse and from Hyde Park as well. The address itself, 1 Cedar Lane, bespoke the alien terrain. The couple now had stunning views of the hills from their terrace and picture windows, but the one-story, two-bedroom wooden structure was set apart. There were no easy sidewalk chats with neighbors here, no strolls to the corner to buy a newspaper or browse in a bookstore. No encounters with colleagues on walks to the campus, only the ubiquitous California carapace. The car permitted escape from this suburban isolation. The Bettelheims wrapped themselves in their carefully acquired European mantle, the Oriental rugs, the Caldas and Domine lithographs, the Matisse tapestry, the reproductions of Rembrandt and Goya etchings, the vitrine filled with objects. Trude was soon digging her trowel in the sloping earth surrounding the house, planting roses and alpine strawberries, determined to remind the newcomers that they were indeed now living in a much different place. We are finding the move to California quite difficult, in parts traumatic, Bettelheim wrote to his former student Nancy Dayton just after taking possession of the house. Life is so very different here, and I miss the university, school, Hyde Park, and all our friends very much. I simply haven't found my bearings in a world where the most important thing is the weather. It pours most of the time. Superscript 1. 2 weeks after that lament, the local headline announced famed psychologist on Stanford faculty. The story reported that Bettelheim had been appointed the visiting professor of psychiatry at the university's medical center, and would also teach summer classes in the education department. The article, based on a Stanford press release, left little doubt that landing this therapist renowned for his work with autism was a major coup. Before World War I, one paragraph read, Bettelheim and his wife took into their European home an autistic American girl aged 7 who had been diagnosed as hopelessly feeble-minded. This was a decade before autism was even described in the medical literature. Superscript. Before long, Stanford students were ducking the machine gun fire that had raked Junk 126 for so many years. He lectured and asked intimidating, confusing, Socratic questions, recalled Jonathan Farber, who sat in the packed hall of Bettelheim's psychoanalysis and education the first summer. His style of interacting with the students was really contemptuous, really disdainful and rude. He cowed the whole group, but when, toward the end of the course, the visiting professor began showing films of the children at the orthogenics, he changed completely, Farber told me. The instant there was a child on the screen, his voice softened and he became warm and affectionate. I came away thinking that he hated students but loved these children. Initially, Bettelheim retained the vicarious connection to his former charges. The phone rang often at 1 Cedar Lane with calls from Jacqueline Sanders seeking advice on how to handle various crises or administrative problems that arose in the weeks after she took over the school. Though she was now 43 years old and a mother, and had been away from Chicago for 7 years, she remained locked in the dependency on her mentor therapist that had developed over her 13 years in his employ. Around this time, however, she resumed therapy with a Chicago psychoanalyst who viewed Bettelheim and his work with a certain skepticism. Over the ensuing months of analysis, Sanders slowly began to realize the degree to which she had allowed herself to be manipulated and exploited, especially when accused Bettelheim of unethical, noting bitterly that the therapeutic situation had given him an unfair hold over her. Superscript 3. Sanders's breakthrough made her so angry that she not only stopped calling Bettelheim about school matters but ceased speaking to him for several years. They had the rapprochement before he died, but the subject of their relationship would remain so painful that she refused to talk about it in detail, telling me only that she felt acutely embarrassed that it had taken her so many years to make peace with how blind she had been. Ruth Marquis, Bettelheim's longtime manuscript doctor, had also come to see him in a new light by the late 1960s. A political liberal, she had been dismayed by his my country right or wrong view of the Vietnam conflict and had found repellent his dismissal of the anti-war protesters as paranoid acts who served to be compared to Nazi youth. Marquis had an experience with a woman neighbor that altered her perspective on Bettelheim's writing as well. "I did it all wrong," the mother told the editor tearfully after reading several pages of "Long is not enough." Marquis explained that Bettelheim had not meant that everything in his book should be taken as gospel, but at the same time she began to see how his works could have a negative impact on readers and felt a degree of responsibility. In The Children of the Dream, which came out in 1969, Bettelheim had once again gratefully acknowledged his friend and collaborator for the loving care with which she had shepherded the manuscript into print. But after 25 years, 8 books, and scores of articles, Marquis had now had enough, and despite Bettelheim's sometimes desperate pleadings, she would play no role in the editing of his future books beyond supplying titles for the next 2.5. The loss of the woman who had shaped his prose for so many years was a serious blow. But Bettelheim had a backup in Linnea Brandwein, who as his typist at the orthogenic school had worked in harness with Marquis. Brandwein had continued to do editorial tasks for him after she left the school in 1965, among them boiling down the dialogues with Mother's transcripts for his Ladies' Home Journal column. These, in turn, were edited by Marquis's successor Joyce Jack. She was a secretary of the magazine when she first encountered the publication's prized columnist, and she was as impressed by him as Marquis had been in the 1940s. In 1967, Jack had taken the Radcliffe College publishing course after graduating from Ohio Wesleyan University, where she had minored in psychology, and when the journal offered her the chance to oversee the column, she was thrilled. Bettelheim communicated with Jack by phone and mail, as he had with Marquis, who lived in Ann Arbor, Michigan, and Brandwein, who lived in South Bend, Indiana, and as with them, he soon came to depend on her. He asked her to join his breakfast, often stayed, basking in the European atmosphere of its rooms and dark paneled lobby. "I was about 26, from the Midwest. It was all terribly glamorous," recalled Jack of that first meeting, at which Bettelheim told her how pleased he was with her work and then stunned her by asking if she would take on his books and articles as well. "There was quite an age difference and I was in awe of him. I felt that he was a really great intellect, a giant," said Jack. Bettelheim had also now acquired for the first time a literary agent, an experienced New York representative named Karen Raines. During the 1960s, the author had grown increasingly disenchanted with the free press, despite his close friendship with its founder, Jeremiah Kaplan, who had seen the possibilities of Long is Not Enough in the 1940s and had published all his works to date. In A Common Writer's Grievance, Bettelheim complained that his books had not been vigorously promoted. At one point, railing at a free press editor that the company had ruined his life's work by not getting behind his output. He told the House that its failure properly to publicize and distribute dialogues with mothers and the informed heart constituted a raw deal and angrily threatened to take his books elsewhere. 7. He finally did so after siding with Raines, who moved him to the prestigious house of Alfred A. Knopf and into the hands of one of publishing's most respected editors, Robert Gottlieb, who counted among his many authors the biographer Robert Carroll, the historian Barbara Tuchman, and the novelists John Wicker and John Cheever. Gottlieb inherited the manuscript in which his new author was trying to sum up his work at the school, the first book that Joyce Jack worked on as well. Knopf published the book in early 1974 under Ruth Marquis's title, A Home for the Heart, and, like Bettelheim's 3 previous books about the school, it received a warm reception. Elizabeth Janeway, writing in the New York Times Book Review, described the author as a natural parabolist, capable of seeing the universe in a grain of sand and passing it on. 8 In the New York Review of Books, child psychoanalyst Elsa first wrote that Bettelheim's clinical resourcefulness and the unfailing respect he showed his psychotic children were remarkable. Christopher Lehman Haupt of the New York Times praised the author for creating a hospital that specializes in the treatment of autistic and severely schizophrenic children, the nurturing milieu that urgently needed to be replicated throughout the country, as Bettelheim proposed. Lehman Haupt lamented that there is only one Bruno Bettelheim, and only a handful of people who approach him in perceptiveness and courage. Superscript 1 degrees in its plea for more humane children's treatment centers, and in its angry attack on ideas that were and were a strong and valuable message, though one that dates back at least to Dickens. Bettelheim's portrait of the orthogenic school is of the loving refuge for troubled children whose physical embrace vividly depicted not only by the prose but in color plates of the dorms, the murals, the statuary, and the carvings on the welcoming front door does indeed deserve replication as widely as possible. But much in the book is little more than self-promotion, just the result that the author claimed he was terrified would be the case unless Joyce Jack kept him from pushing himself into the foreground. Superscript 1 as Bert Collar would put it. The book reads less like a thoughtful summation of a life's work than a public relations report. Superscript 1 once again Bettelheim wrote of his psychoanalytic training, page 11, and of Patsy, the hopeless case he had treated for autism, in Vienna, page 12. He reported that over 25 years only 2 prospective residents had decided not to attend the orthogenic school, p. 186, and once more maintained that better than 85% of those who did were restored to full participation in life, page 6. As in the past, there was no evidence for this claim, since he had commissioned no follow-up study during his 29 years as director. Bettelheim explained that the first principle of treatment was that the children were always right, page 425, and left no doubt that he regarded their privacy as sacrosanct, page 152. He wrote that physical restraint was rarely necessary, page 58, and how important that was to avoid the enticement to dominate the patient, one of the most hazardous temptations to the psychotherapist, page 18. He stressed, too, how crucial it was that the staff demonstrate a deep commitment not to push others around, page 418. The self-described Big Bad Wolf said that he had reorganized the school in the 1940s so there would be no hierarchy, page 216, and made it clear that supervision, which he in fact had practiced over 3 decades on Jacqueline Sanders and many other staff members, did not fit the reality of the therapeutic milieu because it assumes that one person knows more than another, and therefore can direct his work, page 402. Besides such revisionism, Bettelheim indulged his gift for dramatic vignettes. There was the mute schizophrenic child who refused to defecate in the toilets and stuffed them with paper instead. Engineers spent days on end reaming out the pipes, sometimes all the way to the city sewer, to make sure that the toilets worked again the next morning, thus allowing the child to see that he or she, Bettelheim, did not provide name, gender, or age, could again stuff them up when this up to then mute patient not only suddenly started to talk. Now all the stuffed up words overflowed, as the toilets had before. It seemed such a miracle to those who had worked so hard at unplugging the toilets that it was as though through their patient labor they had unplugged the patient, which, in a way, they had. Page 305. Eric Skopler, for one, found this auto-anal breakthrough somewhat lacking in science but nonetheless felt compelled to salute his old professor, observing that, as a rationale for keeping janitors and counselors happy on latrine duty, the equation of bowel movements and language development was sheer artistry. Superscript 1 Superscript 3 was also familiar artistry, turning as it did on the magic arrival of speech, like the tale of Johnny the cactus chewing boy in Richard and Edith Sturba's Vienna waiting room, who after weeks of silence suddenly spoke profound words about psychoanalysis, or the story of Patsy, who had been mute until one day, under Bettelheim's therapeutic care, she made the roots of her anguish clear by asking for the skeleton of George Washington. A Home for the Heart kept its author name before the American public but did not significantly modify his reputation one way or the other. In the fall of 1974, however, the name Bettelheim would become a household word in France. A strike against the RTF, the state broadcasting monopoly in a nation then with no commercial TV, had left the government in desperate need of programming, and among the people it turned to was Daniel Carlin, whose documentary about Bruno Bettelheim and the orthogenic school was now ready. The unions asked Carlin to withhold his film, a request they had every reason to believe he would honor since he was an avowed communist, but the prospect of his work appearing in prime time moderated whatever solidarity he may have previously felt with the workers. The documentary appeared in October in 4 installments, virtually the only television available in a nation of more than 50 million. The films, called collectively on Motor Regards Sur la Folie, A Different View of Madness, take their viewers on an extensive tour of the school, showing its physical warmth, the children in the playground, That volleyball. Drawing. Walking on the midway. Superscript 1 for a girl of about 12 tells Tarlin that the school is a good place and that she is glad that the film will appear in France. So the French will see that disturbed people are not so terrible. The teenager says that she would not have survived had she not come under Bettelheim's benevolent wing. In another scene, a kindly Dr. V leans against the piano talking to two other teenage girls, patting them on the head with avuncular affection. Only at a staff meeting is there any tension, as the counselor's eyes dart about nervously under Bettelheim's and the camera show, using film that Charles Sharp had balanced on a seesaw, feeding her dolls cups of water, hugging one of her counselors. Bettelheim appears, telling Tarlin that when he was in the concentration camps he discovered what an impact environment could have, so he decided to create one at the school that would have a positive effect on children like Marshall. He explains that the school was least successful with such autistic children, helping only 50%. Overall, however, his results were better than 85%. He talks of the importance of privacy and of how, before he took over in the 1940s, children were slapped and beaten, a practice he put a stop to immediately. He tells Tarlin that when the children on his watch got violent and abusive, the school did nothing to restrain them. Harpsichord music plays in the background. Throughout the 4 installments, Tarlin challenges almost nothing Bettelheim says. Nor does he bring on Jacqueline Sanders, Bert Collar, or any other present or former staff members to give their views of what it was like to work at the school. He talks informally with several children, but does not interview any who had left and might have felt freer to talk about their experiences. The viewer hears from no parents, none of the mothers of autistic children who had been devastated by the empty fortress. There are no interviews with Bettelheim's faculty colleagues or former students at the University of Chicago, or with psychotherapists, French or American, who might have brought some perspective to the portrait. Tarlin, who regarded his subject as kind of a genius, told me that he never considered broadening the documentary's scope. In a way, Bettelheim was my master. I had a great deal of admiration and love for him, and I wanted to do these films as a tribute. Much to the filmmaker's astonishment and delight, his homage quickly became the talk of the nation, as the press gave it the kind of running coverage usually reserved for the Tour de France. After the first installment appeared, Le Figaro interviewed Roland Hurley, the psychiatrist who had translated The Empty Fortress into French. He said the naive Tarlin had been seduced by Bettelheim, whose theories on autism were shaky at best, but who was dead indeed in the art of relations publics. Superscript 1.5 after the second segment, which had offered the portrait of Marshall. Le Figaro sought the reaction of Pierre Debris-Ripson, director of the Children's Psychiatric Service at the Necker Hospital, a major medical center in Paris. He called Bettelheim an excellent example of brute psychoanalytique, the braggart side of psychoanalysis, and suggested that, in pushing his 50% and 85% success claims, he was something to the parents of autistic children, and had no idea what role neurological factors might play in autism, yet pretended to know the cause of and therapy for the illness while trained child psychiatrists and pediatricians remained mystified by it. Superscript 1.6 William Savage, Le Figaro's New York correspondent, telephoned Portola Valley to get a response to this attack. Bettelheim asked who was this man Debris-Ripson and then dismissed his criticisms by pointing out that his statistics were published under the auspices of the University of Chicago and had been accepted by Stanford, where he was now an honorary professor. It is on my results that I ask to be judged, on my works, my practice, my books, he told Savage. Superscript 1.7 Bettelheim defenders quickly surfaced in L'Express, the popular news magazine. The columnist wrote that his cure results could not be seriously questioned. Superscript 1.8 A psychoanalyst named Jean Ilhall called Debris-Ripson a complete fanatic in his unshakable belief that the seat of autism was neurological and praised Bettelheim as the uncontested master of his Chicago empire. Superscript 1 on October 17th, ORTF's first channel, where the documentary had made its debut, broadcast a live debate on infantile autism and the methods of Bruno. Bettelheim, among the participants in this evening program, again the only TV fare for millions of viewers, was Roger Mises, a neuropsychiatrist who believed, like Bill Hall, that biology did not explain everything, and Dr Ewen, whose anti-Bettelheim views now spilled out at every opportunity. He said it was monstrous and clownish for state television to devote so much time to this purveyor of Freudian mythology, whose parent blaming was la tare de la crème de la pensée contemporaine, the cream pie of contemporary thought. Superscript to degrees, this being France. The debate was politicized in some quarters. In L'Humanité, the communist daily, Tony Lane, the child psychiatrist who, like his friend Daniel Hartlin, was a communist, called Bettelheim a courageous man whose belief that autistic children could be rescued placed him in the Marxist tradition that held that all nature was transformable. Superscript to superscript 1 on the far right, the weekly minute ref in Dr Ewen's assault. Not only implying that Bettelheim was an imposter but branding him an extreme leftist and sarcastically suggesting that Carlin had made the flattering documentary because, as a communist, he did not dare criticize a Zionist. Superscript to superscript 2 some of the pie-throwing that followed the airing of unvoter regards Sooner lawfully was just that, and, in the case of Minute, worse. But what is striking about the coverage, which went on 4 days in papers throughout the country, 3 instances, the complex subject of treatment by informed specialists, and a large population was drawn into an intellectually challenging discussion of a profoundly enigmatic illness. This debate marked the first time that Bettelheim's work had been scrutinized in a wide public forum. No such examination had ever occurred in the United States, where broadcast and print journalists had been complicit in building Bettelheim's reputation ever since he had published his concentration camp report in 1943. Almost without exception, the American media had viewed him through a heroic filter, the same one Carlin had used in shooting the documentary that, ironically, had finally provoked a loud dialogue. Whatever boost Bettelheim may have gotten from all the attention in France was dampened by the fact that he was facing another cataract operation at the time. The one in Chicago 5 years before, after which he had had to lie with his head immobile for so many days, had left him with good corrected vision in his left eye, but 4 months now he had been virtually unable to see out of the right one, which was steadily deteriorating. Superscript to superscript 3 he contemplated the new operation, as he had the first, with considerable anxiety. He was now 71 years old and knew that merely going under the anesthetic at his age was risky. The operation was scheduled for December 2nd, and as the date approached he called Joyce back on the East Coast. I think he was afraid he was going to die and wanted to say goodbye, she recalled. The procedure was a complete success, giving the patient 20/25 corrected vision once the eye had healed. Bettelheim told Carl Frankenstein of being blindfolded for a period after the operation and of how it gave him time to reflect that, even in old age, one tends to take one's body for granted despite daily reminders of its shortcomings. Not being able to see for a time was quite an experience, he told his Israeli friend. I doubt it has made me wiser, as it should. But it was a big step in the direction of accepting the end when it will finally come. Superscript to 9 months after the operation, Bettelheim's body gave him reason to fear that the end might be near. He and Trude had undertaken a demanding summer trip through Europe, first visiting Eric in London and then traveling to Normandy for a meeting of French audience. After lectures in Geneva and Basel, Bruno returned to France for a 10-day seminar in Lyon, during which he experienced periodic shortness of breath and pain in his chest that radiated into his left arm. I had my comeuppance, he would tell Nancy Dayton. Teaching in French all day long proved too much of a strain for my heart and I suffered an insufficiency. Superscript 2-5 the lionist prescribed nitroglycerin, not hospitalization, but the patient agreed only to bed rest for several days, until he was deemed well enough to fly home. There his doctor ordered absolute rest for a week and cancellation of all engagements for a month. While Bettelheim recuperated, he had other bodily betrayals to contemplate. The severe arterial sclerosis in his legs continued to make walking painful, and he now suffered as well from a mild case of adult-onset diabetes and from Zenker's diverticulum, an abnormal pouch in his upper esophagus that at many meals made him feel as if food was sticking in his throat. Initially these episodes caused discomfort for a few minutes and then passed, but they steadily worsened, occasionally causing gagging spells that drove their victim from the table in frightening coughing fits. There was no medication to alleviate the problem, so Bettelheim did his best to control it by avoiding meat and other coarse foods. Superscript to 6. Despite this precaution, there was no predicting the onset of a serious attack, and he felt increasingly anxious about going to dinner parties and restaurants, fearing he would embarrass himself. This really was a torment, an unbelievable torment, recalled Eric Bettelheim, whose thacker eventually taught him how to force open his throat if he began to choke. Bettelheim coped with his medical crises as he did with most other setbacks, by forging ahead with work. He was not only teaching at Stanford but in the mid-1970s spent the spring semester doing the same back at the University of Chicago, immersing himself in the familiar precincts of Hyde Park, seeing old friends, and occasionally visiting the orthogenic school. He continued to accept speaking engagements, and his talks often drew on the project that was now his central focus, an exploration of the psychological meaning of fairy tales that would become his next and most popular work, The Uses of Enchantment. In a letter to Carl Frankenstein, Bettelheim wondered if perhaps he had entered into his second childhood, because he was now finding such enjoyment in rereading the stories and speculating about their message. But he also gave his interest a darker interpretation, suggesting that it flowed from a semi-conscious feeling that only a brother's worm-like miracle could save the Jews in the long run. Superscript to 7. Robert Gottlieb Knopf was enthusiastic about the book, and Bruno was very excited about it, wanted it to be really good. Superscript to 8. However, the literary luster of his new publishing house intimidated him, as did the scope of this new undertaking. His mother had read fairy tales to him, but he had not done likewise very often for Ruth, Naomi, and Eric, explaining that he had accepted the prevailing view at the time that the fairy tales were bad for children. Which some had. Superscript to. He knew the little Frankenstein that it was astonishing how little had been written on the topic. Superscript 3 degrees. With some trepidation, he now plunged into this imaginary void, and as the manuscript developed he repeatedly expressed almost obsequious gratitude to Joyce Jack for rescuing his course material. Superscript 3. Superscript 1. He urged her to make the book succinct and interesting from start to finish. As I suggested on the phone, he wrote, I would like very much that you let yourself go much more, criticizing, suggesting what needs to be changed, added. But what I did not say on the phone is that I would be delighted if you add some spontaneous writing of your own. I know you are an excellent writer, so why not write some passages to include in the manuscript? The more the better. Superscript 3. Superscript to. Jack did not take up this invitation, but, like Ruth Marquis before her, she played a crucial role in organizing the manuscript and making Bettelheim's prose read, help for which he usually paid her double what she billed him. Despite this editorial first aid, the manuscript still needed work after it arrived at Knopf. At one point, Gottlieb sent Bettelheim a letter recommending a number of specific changes and in general urging him to curb his reparativeness and his tendency to give the fairy tales simplistic, dogmatic Freudian interpretations, defects that had worried Jack as well but that she had managed to ameliorate only in part. In one passage, Bettelheim had written that, absent a certain kind of fairy tale, a child is subject to Oedipal anguish without relief. Gottlieb told his author that he was loading the dice, making it appear as if no other comfort were possible. He was taking too much for granted and was bound to put off the reader. Superscript 3. Superscript 3. As with Jack, Bettelheim was abject in his response. You are so very right with all you point out, that I am worried that you did not find more to criticize, he wrote to Gottlieb. After offering a tentative modification of the passage, he told his editor to feel free to rewrite it in any other and better way to meet your most justified objections, and worried that because he was deemed an expert on children Gottlieb might hesitate to be rigorous in his criticism. Please remember my reputation was not made as a writer, but as a therapist. I need your help badly as an author. Superscript 3. For Bettelheim had also needed help while researching the book, and one place he found it was in a psychiatric study of fairy tales, their origin, meaning and usefulness. Superscript 3. 5. This 1963 volume, by a clinical psychiatrist named Julius Hercher, was rich with psychological gingerbread, and, like the hungry Hansel, Bettelheim helped himself. Superscript 3. 6. For Hercher, Fairy tales were under page 53. For Bettelheim, originated formed what the process of human development consists of bb. Page 12. In the uses of enchantment, Bettelheim stressed that parents should bring a certain attitude to the telling of the tales. One must never explain to the child the meanings of fairy tales. However, the narrator's understanding of the fairy tale's message to the child's preconscious mind is important. It furthers the adult's sensitivity to selection of those stories which are most appropriate to the child's state of development and to the specific psychological difficulties he is confronted with at the moment. bb. Page 155. More than a decade before, Hercher had written, "While one must never explain the fairy tales to the child, the narrator's understanding of their meaning is very important. It furthers the sensitivity for selecting those stories which are most appropriate in various phases of the children's development and for stressing those themes which may be therapeutic for specific psychological difficulties." J.H. Page 186. Bettelheim criticized children's literature as one-sided. bb. Page 7. The term that Hercher used a dozen times to mean materialistic. J.H. Page 51 and elsewhere. Bettelheim stated Hercher's view that fairy tales become refined by years of retelling. bb. Page 5. J.H. Pages 5 to 8 and, like Hercher, defended the tales as a good means for a child to comprehend his destructive impulses. bb. Page 55. J.H. Page 188. Each author set up distinctions between fairy tales and myths and between fairy tales and dreams. Pages 26, 36. J.H. Pages 4, 10. To Bettelheim, The Frog King was in part about women getting over the sex taboo and frogs puffing themselves up like erections. bb. Page 290, which was how Hercher saw the tale. J.H. Page 138. Both authors criticized what they regarded as the prettified version of Sleeping Beauty handed down by the 17th century French fairy tale collector Charles Perrault. bb. Page 230, J.H. Page 99, and both attacked Disney and television. bb. Page 24, J.H. Pages 189 to 95. In a passage discussing how an individual's growth depends on the relationship to another person, Hercher wrote, without a doubt, "There is no real existence." J.H. Pages 58 to 59. Bettelheim wrote that, on however high a plane one's life proceeds, the I without the thou lives a lonely existence. bb. Page 278. This dichotomy was a major precept of the philosopher Martyr 23 superscript 37. Bettelheim credited no one. In exploring the psychology of fairy tales, Hercher chose to interpret Hansel and Gretel, Little Red Riding Hood, Snow White, and Brighter Rose, also called Sleeping Beauty. Bettelheim analyzed the same tales in the same order, adding Jack and the Beanstalk, Goldilocks and the Three Bears, and Cinderella. Bettelheim appropriated the three-phase childhood development scheme that Hercher loosely attributed to psychology, philosophy, and religion, and also used Hercher's examples when linking certain fairy tales to certain phases of development. In both books, Little Red Riding Hood and Snow White are about latency, Sleeping Beauty is about adolescence, and Hansel and Gretel is about the developing infant's relationship to his parents. Of which Hercher wrote, the awful frustrations inherent in early childhood training lead to an emotional interaction between the child and the parents in which the latter, at least unconsciously, at night are experienced as unloving, selfish, and rejecting. Since they need their parents desperately, children attempt to counteract, to deny this rejection. In fact, Hansel succeeds in finding the way back from the forest in which they were abandoned the following day. J.H. Pages 63 to 64. Bettelheim put it this way: it is the child's anxiety and deep disappointment when mother is no longer willing to meet all his moral demands which leads him to believe that suddenly mother has become unloving, selfish, rejecting. Since the children know they need their parents desperately, they attempt to return home after being deserted. In fact, Hansel succeeds in finding their way back from the forest the first time they are abandoned. bb. Page 159. Hercher went on, ... Hansel and his sister Gretel appear successful at first. But the frustrations at home continue. The mother seems to become more shrewd in her plans for rejecting the children, and finally convinces the father again to abandon them. J.H. page 64. Bettelheim wrote, "The children's successful return home does not solve anything. Their effort to continue life as before, as if nothing had happened, is to no avail. The frustrations continue, and the mother becomes more shrewd in her plans for getting rid of the children." B.B. page 160. In discussing Snow White, Hercher wrote, "Not wishing to deprive anyone too much, she eats just a little from each of the 7 plates and drinks just a drop from each glass. How different from Hansel and Gretel, who, rather disrespectfully, start eating the gingerbread house." J.H. Adams. Snow White eats just a little from each of the plates and glasses, so as to rob none of the dwarfs too much. How different from Hansel and Gretel, the orally fixated children, who disrespectfully and voraciously eat up the gingerbread house. B.B. page 208. Bettelheim did not list Hercher's book in his bibliography, more than half of which consisted of German titles, and he acknowledged him only once in his 122 endnotes, in an aside about European interpretations of fairy tales. B.B. page 314. Nor is Hercher the only source that Bettelheim failed to credit. In 1941, Gyula Roheim, a Hungarian psychoanalyst noted for his interest in fairy tales, wrote, "A folk tale is a narrative with a happy end. A myth is a tragedy." Superscript 3.8. Bettelheim wrote that the ending in myths is nearly always tragic, while always happy in fairy tales. B.B. page 37. 6 years after Bettelheim was born, Freud's protege Otto Rank, who had applied psychoanalytic theory to legend and myth, wrote, "The fictitious romance is the excuse, as it were, for the hostile feelings which the child harbors against his father, and which in this fiction are projected against the father. The child simply gets rid of the father in the neurotic romance, while in the myth the father endeavors to lose the child." Superscript 3. Bettelheim wrote that the wish to be rid of the parent arouses great guilt. So in the reversal which eliminates the guilt feeling, this wish, too, is projected onto the parent. Thus, in fairy tales there are parents who try to rid themselves of their child. B.B. page 204. Even when Bettelheim did cite the source, he was sometimes offhand, as when he noted that the psychoanalyst and social philosopher Eric Fromm, in his book The Forgotten Language, makes some references to fairy tales, particularly to Little Red Riding Hood. B.B. pages 313 to 14. In fact, as the novelist, critic, and children's book author Alison Lurie observed in her review of the uses of enchantment, Bettelheim repeated most of Fromm's points in his discussion of the story. For degrees Bettelheim had been in this forest before, scrambling for nuts and berries that would give him something to say about concentration camps or parenting or autism or the kid book theme or the youth culture, but seldom digesting his pickings before announcing their meaning to a waiting world. His message this time, as it had been so often in the past, was unequivocal. The overwhelming bulk of so-called children's literature attempts to entertain or to inform, for both. But most of these books are so shallow in substance that little of significance can be gained from them. However, nothing was as enriching as fairy tales. Moines found the right solutions to their predicaments in any society than from any other type of story within a child's comprehension. For superscript 1 to buttress this claim, Bettelheim again resorted to his favorite device, the anonymous anecdote. In a typical example, he wrote of how the bottled-up giant in The Fisherman and the Genie grows increasingly angry the longer he is confined, until he finally announces that he will slay whoever releases him. "This is exactly how a young child feels when he has been deserted," explained Bettelheim, who then told of a 3-year-old boy left in the care of a woman while his parents traveled abroad for several weeks. First the child looked forward to his mother and father's return, then he grew angry with them for staying away, and when they finally did come home he froze into a silence that took several weeks of compassion and understanding to melt. This child did not speak to his parents because the idea that forces may reside within us which are beyond our control is too threatening to be entertained, wrote Bettelheim. To reinforce this point, he summoned up a 7-year-old who said, when his parents told him that his emotions had carried him away, You mean there is a machine in me that ticks away all the time and at any moment may explode me? Foursquare Bettelheim maintained that children almost always drew benign instruction from fairy tales and that psychoanalytic principles readily explained these responses, the reductive view that neither Joyce, Jack, nor Robert Gottlieb had been able to keep in check. Dogs symbolized the ego, hunters the father figure, apples mature sexual desire, and the three bears the penis and the two testes in the male vagina and the two breasts in the female. For superscript 3-1 reviewer. The reader wasn't in the nursery, but in what Vladimir Nabokov called the fundamentally medieval world of Freud, with its crankish quest for sexual symbols, something like searching for Beethoven and acrostics in Shakespeare's works, and its weaker little embryos spying from their natural nooks upon the love life of their parents. 44 In another critic's view, Bettelheim looked at fairy tales as if they had no history, analyzing them flattened out, like patients on a couch, in a timeless contemporaneity. 45 For all his borrowing, he seems largely ignorant of, or at least unwilling to consider, the vast exploration of literary romance that predated psychoanalysis and that offered alternative explanations for what a tale might mean. As the fairy tale scholar Jack Zips has pointed out, the symbols and patterns of the tales reflect specific forms of social behavior and activity which often can be traced back as far as the Ice and Mesolithic ages. 46 In 18th century France, the peasantry heard a Little Red Riding Hood in which the wolf kills the grandmother, into of this repast, and when she catcalls her a slut for devouring the remains of her elderly kin, she is then forced to do a striptease by the wolf, lured into bed by him, and eaten. 47 No father figure hunter arrives to save the day. No one cuts open the wolf's belly to free grandmother and granddaughter for the happy ending that Bettelheim had heard as a child in Vienna, and that he now found so salutary because children saw in the opposite figures of the wolf and hunter the conflict between the idea and the ego superego aspects of their personality. 48 Even had the French peasants been able to riffle through the psychopathology of everyday life, they might be pardoned for feeling that the main lesson of the bloody tale was that wolves are best avoided, a pragmatic message that a 6-year-old snug in her pajamas in Shaker Heights might also draw from the happily ever after version. But for Bettelheim the tales were first and foremost psychoanalytic prisms. Through them the child begins to understand at least at a preconscious level that only those experiences which overwhelm us arouse in us corresponding inner feelings with which we cannot deal. Once we have mastered those, we need not fear any longer the encounter with the wolf. 4 No doubt Bettelheim could have made much of Lewis Carroll's rabbit hole, but he rejected with his usual ex cathedra certainty the possibility that a young twentieth-century reader might find Alice's adventure as instructive as Cinderella's, that her encounters with the Red Queen and the Mad Hatter might prove at least as intriguing as and less sexist than a distant world of pumpkins, palaces, princes, and proper slipper sizes. He did not speculate on whether Dorothy's terrifying tornado ride to Munchkinland, the remarkable characters she met there and in the Emerald City, and her safe return to Kansas might be just as delightful and therapeutic for a child as Jack's greedy chases up and down the beanstalk after eggs and harps of gold. For Bettelheim, the large body of modern children's classics was invisible, as if hidden in the shadow cast by a grim, culture-bound giant. There were not only no uses for Alice in Wonderland and the Wizard of Oz, but none for The Wind in the Willows, Winnie the Pooh, Charlotte's Web, A Wrinkle in Time, The Lion, The Witch and the Wardrobe, The Yearling, The Little Prince, The Lord of the Rings, The 13 Clocks, The Phantom Toll Booth, Willy Wonka and the Chocolate Factory, Curious George, Little Women, Heidi, or The Fantastic World of Dr. Seuss, where Bartholomew Cubbins faces beheading because he cannot take off his hat before the king, and Horton the elephant hatches an egg. There was no place for Bambi either, even though the popular 1923 story of the steadfast young deer was written by him, and offered just the kind of dramatic that the struggle against severe difficulties in life is unavoidable. But if one meets these often unjust hardships bravely, one masters all obstacles, and at the end he emerges victorious. 5 Degrees Bettelheim was so confident that contemporary children's literature was vacuous that he didn't need to read it. When Where the Wild Things Are, the mother of an obstreperous boy named Max calls him the wild thing, and when he threatens to eat her up she sends him to bed without any supper. In Maurice Sendak's perennial bestseller, winner of the Caldecott Medal in 1964, Max not only meets an assortment of monsters in his banishment but controls these hairy, horned beasts. He has fun with this power but eventually grows weary of it and longs to return home. When he does, his supper awaits him, still hot. Bettelheim had never opened where the wild things are, but he assured a group of mothers to ask him about it that Sendak was obviously captivated by an adult psychological understanding of how to deal with destructive fantasies in the child. What he failed to understand is credible fear it evokes in the child to be sent to bed without supper, and this by the first and foremost giver of food and security, his mother. To the question, but why do children love this book? He had no answer. 5 Superscript 1 The précis he had heard from the mothers gave him enough information to suggest that Max had been on just the kind of a scary, exciting escape that appeals to most children. Especially since he ends up fairy tales safe where someone loved him best of all. 5 Superscript 2 But Bettelheim seemed bent on scolding Max's mother for exiling her son, saying that had he written the book he would have had her explain to him why he wanted to eat her up rather than have her send him to bed hungry. 5 Superscript 3 Knox published The Uses of Enchantment in 1976. Several critics attacked the book for its historicism, repetitiveness, and psychoanalytic template. One of them suggesting that perhaps the work demonstrated that the truest fairy tale is Freud psychology. 54 None of the reviews mentioned Bettelheim's uses of Julia Searcher's fairy tale study, a disclosure that would not come until 1978, when Joan Blows, the American editor of children's literature in education, noted the plagiarism in an obscure professional journal. 55 Her revelations made little impact and would not surface again until 12 years later, when the folklorist Talent Duns caused the media stir by citing them after Bettelheim's suicide. 56 Was he really Bruno Barrow? I am. Asked Newsweek. 57 Blows, Duns, and Alison Burry thought so, as did others. But Hercher himself was generous. We all plagiarized. I plagiarized whether it came out of my own brain. I'm only happy that I would have influenced Bruno Bettelheim. 58 Others were also forgiving. The scholar Harold Bloom noted Bettelheim's reductiveness, but was nonetheless moved, charmed, and frequently persuaded by the humane effort to clarify the demonic ground of romance and so to substitute the uses of enchantment for the uncanny actualities of the enchantment. 5 Most critics praised the author for his obvious love of the stories, and for promulgating them with such enthusiasm. In the New York Times Book Review, John Updike saluted him for writing a charming book about enchantment. 6 Degrees Some parents doubtless embraced the uses of enchantment because of its Freudian certainties, but for most it was likely the author's overall message that fairy tales were good for their children that drew them to the book. Now they had Bruno Bettelheim's imprimatur. Children could well handle encounters with wolves and witches, even at bedtime. In an insightful passage, Bettelheim wrote, parents who wish to deny that their child has murderous wishes and wants to tear things and even people into pieces believe that their child must be prevented from engaging in such thoughts as if this were possible. By denying access to stories which implicitly tell the child that others have the same fantasies, he is left to feel that he is the only one who imagines such things. This makes his fantasies really scary. 6 Superscript 1 The uses of enchantment sold steadily, and by 1995 the New York Public Library would name it one of the 159 most influential and frequently requested books of the century, putting it in the company of the Bible, Ulysses, 1984, The Joy of Cooking, The Common Sense Book of Baby and Child Care, Mein Kampf, and Bettelheim might have been surprised to learn where the wild things are. 6 Superscript 2 Despite the mixed reception by reviewers, in 1977 the uses of enchantment received both a National Book Critics Circle Prize for Criticism and a National Book Award for Contemporary Thought, in the latter case winning out over works by such finalists as Dostoevsky, biographer Joseph Frank, and architecture critic Ada Louise Huxtable. Other recipients of National Book Awards that year included Irving Howe for World of Our Fathers, and Willis Stepner for his novel The Spectator Bird. At the time, the awards were administered by the American Academy and Institute of Arts and Letters, the pantheon of America's cultural elite, which included at least 3 of Bettelheim's early admirers, Meyer Shapiro, Dwight MacDonald, and James T. Farrell. At the black tie presentation ceremony, C. P. Snow, the knighted British scientist and novelist, made the principal remarks with his acceptance speech, which began upon the Big C. There was a very old city. The 73-year-old recipient, self-conscious about his countenance even at this moment of high honor, spoke first of how the mother in this very old city had wanted a second child and how relieved she had been when he turned out to be a boy because he was so. He told of how, in 1914, the lights had gone out forever all over Europe, and of how an old emperor had lost his domain after ruling, it seemed to the boy, since the beginning of time. He told of how the boy, when grown, spent years of contemplation on a couch specially constructed for the purpose by a famous sorcerer, and of how even this greatest magician of his time could not exorcise the vicious dragon that invaded the land soon after our hero had completed his apprenticeship on the couch. He feared he would never escape from the dragon's minions, called the SS, but, encouraged by the optimism of fairy tales, he struggled on and was miraculously carried across the ocean to the fair city where he and his audience were now gathered. In this new and free land, his beloved soon joined him, after having traveled around the whole world. They married, had 3 children, and lived happily ever after. 6 superscript 3 in private. Boy who grew up to win a National Book Award regarded the accolade with a certain sourness. He complained that the book, not he, had been recognized, because what had really impressed the judges were the tales and not his treatment of them. He conceded the prize was nice but car paid that he had to fly in an instant to New York for the ceremony. 64 He also maintained that the New York Times Book Review had treated the uses of enchantment favorably because the editor felt guilty about not publishing an apology or correction after the review had wrongly attacked the author. Bettelheim did not specify the nature of the assault, but said the editor's guilt had also moved him to give Bettelheim books by Thomas Shash and R. D. Ladding to review. The assignment was the editor's subtle way out, asking me to review 2 very difficult books, hoping I would fall flat on my face, either rejecting the assignment, which showed that I was afraid to take a stand, or reviewing the books unfairly or stupidly. 65 Harvey Shapiro, the review's editor in 1976, called this notion madness and could remember no dispute with Bettelheim. He did recall the author's marvelous acceptance speech at the National Book Awards fete, as well as a visit the winner paid to his office. Shapiro told me he enjoyed their meeting but was perplexed by his guest's reaction when invited to sit in an easy chair. Bettelheim said I was putting him in the grandpapa chair. He was sort of hostile, as if I were a sense of inferiority and a growing bitterness. Sir California. Though he continued to teach for a while at the University of Chicago, he eventually had to cut that tie and came to regard the institution as ungrateful. In a letter to Nancy Dayton, he complained that he had been paid very meagerly and that, though he had raised several $1 million over the years and had added the luster of his reputation to the university, he had been put out to pasture without as much as a line of thanks or good wishes. He conceded that a few orthogenic school associates had bidden him a warm farewell, but they had worked for him. Those for whom I worked did not find it worth their while to say goodbye to me. They probably felt good riddance, but did they have to make it so obvious? 66 Bettelheim did not mention that in 1970 he had been honored by the university and the city's gentry at a formal dinner of a kind few, if any, of his faculty colleagues could hope for, an elegant event whose sponsors had included the president and 3 former presidents of the university, and at which the principal speaker, the nation's Secretary of Health, Education, and Welfare, had saluted the honoree for his work. It was in the warm glow of that evening that the Bruno Bettelheim Chair had been announced, and its name, sake now also felt wounded that the university had not demonstrated sufficient appreciation for his role in raising funds for the endowed professorship. On this point, he would soon have reason to be even more bitter. As conceived, the chair was to draw a succession of distinguished psychotherapists to the directorship of the orthogenic school. After Jacqueline Sanders had held the post for several years, and had received an appointment in psychiatry from the university, she asked for the chair. Hannah Gray, who became president of Chicago in 1978, turned her down, saying her credentials were not strong enough. No small irony, given that the inspiration for the chair had faked his own. With Sanders and Cons as director, the fund for the chair sat and grew until it approached $1 million. Money that ultimately became part of the school's endowment after the university finally decided in the 1980s that a named professorship was out of proportion for a treatment center that housed only 50 residents and historically had done no significant research. 67 This slat only confirmed Bettelheim's belief that he was forever an outsider, as did his continued rejection by the psychoanalytic establishment. With typical if transparent disdain, he wrote to Daniel Carlin, "Deep down, I really do not care about what others say. I know this is very arrogant, but it is also a defense I developed as a result of years of calumnies. For example, I am still not a member of the American or the International Psychoanalytic Associations because I reject mutilations, which explains the guarded if not had I added official. And the reason for all this is that I dared to say that in some points Freud ought to be corrected." 68 Bettelheim also had to contend with the young psychiatrists on the Stanford faculty, most of whom were committed to research and tended to regard seeing patients as gut work. They saw their job as correcting imbalances in the bodily fluids, pharmacology. You can imagine how congenial that was to Bruno. It is an understatement to say that they didn't make him feel welcome at all, recalled old Alvin Rosenfeld, who in 1977 became director of training in child psychiatry at Stanford Medical School. Not long after the Harvard-educated Rosenfeld arrived in Palo Alto, Bettelheim knocked on his office door soliciting a contribution for a Jewish charity. The young psychiatrist was immediately drawn to his famous visitor, whose intellectual achievements he would describe as legendary. 6 Rosenfeld was more than 40 years Bettelheim-ish junior, but he found talking to the gruff septuagenarian invigorating. He also sensed that Bettelheim was adrift in the academic community, especially after the School of Education had, without asking Bettelheim's permission, assigned a student to share his small office. Bettelheim seldom displayed warm affection, but he clearly welcomed the new friendship and was delighted when Rosenfeld suggested that they teach a weekly seminar together for psychotherapists in training. Rosenfeld knew this was a risky invitation, for more than age separated the two men. Rosenfeld was deliberate and soft-spoken, his teaching style supportive rather than confrontational. Bettelheim's reputation for abrasiveness and self-aggrandizement was well known on campus, as was his hostile attitude toward the anti-war protesters. But Rosenfeld felt strongly that young therapists could benefit from what Bettelheim had learned over 3 decades running the orthogenic school. 7 degrees Rosenfeld came to love the older man, the devotion for which he paid a heavy price that he had taken up with such a notoriously unscientific partner made his younger colleagues standoffish. Committee assignments were denied him, invitations were not forthcoming. One person tried to trick me into saying Bruno had done something wrong in helping someone with a dissertation, hoping to get him in trouble with Stanford. Rosenfeld told me. Still, like the classes in Jug 126, the seminars were popular. They would last for 6 years, attracting not just aspiring therapists but practicing ones, as well as medical students and social workers. As at Chicago, some participants found Bettelheim's cutting style offensive and abandoned the sessions, but most stayed. Intrigued by his dissection of the cases they presented or by his insistent crime is to undergo a personal analysis. 7 Intimidating but also amusing his apprehensive listeners. To be discovered by somebody else has never done any good to anybody, he told one meeting, stressing the importance of self-discovery. You know, there's the story that when Columbus discovered America, the Indians said, "We are discovered. That is the end of us." And indeed it was. 7 Superscript 2 In 1993, after Bettelheim's death, Rosenfeld published The Art of the Obvious under their joint authorship based on transcripts of the seminars, using his mentor's classic technique. He told his readers that because they would find it tedious to wade through verbatim material, he had selected parts from many different sessions that dealt with the same or related subjects, and then stitched them together and added narrative scenes to create a composite. 7 Superscript 3 Bettelheim enjoyed the new platform Rosenfeld had provided, but it was not enough to overcome his growing depression, an obsessive focus of which had now become the plight of the Jews. In 1976, he congratulated Nancy Dayton on achieving tenure, telling her to enjoy her new one's security as a professor because there was no security in the world for Jews. 74 A few weeks later, during his spring stint teaching at the University of Chicago, he stayed at the Hotel Shoreland on Hyde Park's lakefront. He again wrote Dayton, saying he enjoyed being back in a real city but complaining about staying in a hotel in an neighborhood that was once his home. Will the Jews never find real homes? 75 In letter after letter, he told Carl Frankenstein of how anxious he felt about the threat to Israel and how guilty he was that he could do so little to help. W. Can an American Jew who sits in relative comfort and security say to a dear friend in Jerusalem, "It's hypocritical when I say that no day, often no hour passes that I do not agonize about Israel, but then what is that compared to what you all must be going through? How can one live these days as a Jew?" 76 Frankenstein told his American friend he should face that question by being a mensch, to which Bettelheim replied, "Naturally, you are absolutely right. One can live only as a mensch, but that is even more difficult, as you well know." 77 Well before entering Dachau in 1938, Bettelheim had struggled with his manhood in the shadow of his father's syphilis, which had left him embarrassed by his looks and unsure of his sexual powers, in a marriage to a young woman who did not reciprocate his affection, in the forced role of lumber dealer, which made him feel doubly the outsider, merchant and Jew. He had felt helpless to change these conditions, and when the SS Dragon came to get him, he was helpless again. Like millions of other Jews, he did not fight the mensch at this crucial moment caused him great trauma with humility and insight. Instead, he became an avenging angel, telling the Jews how they should have behaved when the Nazis came, delivering the stern rebukes about ghetto thinking that run through his work like barbed wire and that caused more outrage over the decades than any other subject he touched.